Okay, so here we are. We're going to discuss the one and only, the inimitable, the genius, the polymath, Mr. Stephen J. Gould. Gould was born in 1941 and he died in 2002 at the age of 60. He had become, by his death, the most famous scientist in America. He was known above all for the essays in these books that are listed here on the side here that are called like reflections or more reflections, all in the concept of natural history. Natural history means the topic of uh, history of our planet and of the natural environment. It includes us, but it really is about everything besides us, which, if you don't know, is most other things and for way, way longer than we ever have existed. We've been here. There's a way of doing this. You have to use metaphor, but the Earth has been here 4.54 billion years. The universe has been here 13 billion years. Humans have been here 200,000 years. You can't even comprehend how little time we've been here without a metaphor. We've been here. If this is the history of the universe from here to here, we've been here like if I filed my fingernail, that difference, that little bit of dust that would come off my fingernail, that's how long we've existed. Okay, so natural history is this very rich topic. It includes things you're familiar with, like dinosaurs, fossils, the what's called paleontology. That's what Gould was. Gould was a geologist. He was a paleontologist. He's known for a concept called punctuated equilibrium. In any case, Gould grew up in New York City, in Queens. He was affiliated with the Natural History Museum his whole life, but it started, and it really gave him his impetus to become a scientist. When he was 5, he went to visit the Natural History Museum with his dad, returning from World War II, and he was standing before the Tyrannosaurus Rex, and someone coughed, and it scared him, and he told this story many times. That set him on this course where he's like, the awe of the dinosaur and everything made him want to become a paleontologist. He found fame almost by accident. The museum, and I'm talking about the museum in the Upper West Side. You've probably been there, American Museum of Natural History. He was working as a young professor of paleontology and geology, and he had an affiliation with the museum. They have a magazine called Natural History. It still exists. And they said, hey, why don't you try writing a column for us? He said, okay. And then he went on to write that column for almost 30 years, from the early 1970s until his death. He wrote 300 essays on a monthly basis for 300 consecutive months. And they made him famous. And they do things like compare, baseball with phenomena in natural history. They talk about odd organisms like the panda that has this thumb that it developed out of its wrist bone to eat bamboo. He was a brilliant person for illustrating general principles from little tiny details in the natural world. And Gould was also famous, and this is why he's so dear to me in part. He was a famous political activist. When he was young, he participated in the civil rights movement. His father was a leftist as well, surveilled by the FBI. And Gould eventually ended up, once he was a prominent figure in American life as a writer, he advocated against intelligence testing and in favor of universal social programs, and not saying, okay, so and so has this IQ, we can't help them. He showed that all these measures were wrong, and you see him here in these essays trying to give you a sense of how radical Darwin's ideas were, but then in a sense also how there was an audience waiting for Darwin, and that audience wasn't just in the scientific community. It was in the most advanced political thinking of the time, which is still very advanced thinking, communism. Okay, Marx and Engels embraced Darwin. That's the basic lesson of these essays that we're looking at. And let's talk about them now. So the first one here, and I mentioned this before in class, but I'll just go over it again, is called Darwin's delay. Darwin's delay. Yes, ma'am. And what is Darwin's delay? Darwin wrote a very famous book and it was published in 1859 called Origins of Species. This book announced his theory of evolution, which was already widely discussed, that organisms had probably evolved and they weren't fixed, set by their creator, that they had developed over time and changed, and there were other names for like transmutation and this sort of thing. But Darwin had an idea for how the evolution was occurring. What's the mechanism? And you probably have heard the term natural selection, and the bastardized popular, the survival of the fittest. The organism creates more offspring than can possibly survive, so most don't. The ones that do are more or less, on average, more adapted to their environment. That's partly why they're surviving. There's luck and chance too, which Gould is a big advocate. But then on average, over time, the ones that are surviving are the most suited to their environment. And that's natural selection. That's the fit survive, okay? There's all kinds of other arguments for how evolution functions now. Darwin had no concept of the genes, DNA, genetic drift. He had no concept really of catastrophes that come and influence the history of life in extraordinary ways. And Gould's main critique, actually, of Darwin has a name that's really relevant to our current predicament in the crisis. It's called punctuated equilibrium. Gould said Darwin would tell you things are going gradually over time. Gould said, no, if you look at the fossil record, there is no gradual change. There's stasis, organisms stable, and then there's sudden change, and then there's a new stasis, and there's sudden change, and then there's new stasis. So organisms evolve relatively rapidly, and then they're basically static for the course of their entire existence until they go extinct. And he got this idea from having a Marxist background in his family, and the idea of a political, economic turmoil, revolution, crisis, and the way time seems to change tempo during a political upheaval. Like you're seeing, there's a cliche in Marxism that in a crisis, days become years. In other words, the amount of change that would normally take years or decades can happen in days. And so you've seen that in the stock market today, where the last week or two, all the gains that had accrued in the last 3 years of Trump's presidency are wiped out by the fact that people can't go to work suddenly, and the future is uncertain, and no one wants to bet on companies making money. So, anyways, in any case, point being this: what's Darwin's delay about? 1859, he publishes this book, but for 20 years he sat on the discovery. He hadn't published the findings that he had, the insight he had about natural selection. Why not? And Gould goes over a bunch of reasons. People say, oh, he was busy writing a book about coral reefs. Oh, he was trying to come up with the most examples and so on. None of that information is actually convincing to Gould. And what Gould hits upon is that Darwin was very, very aware of what the philosophical implication, that is what his theory presumed. That name for that was a big no-no. It was like considered too radical for the time, and he was afraid to do it. Okay? And what is the name for that? Well, if you follow me now, I'm on page 24 of Darwin's Delay. Page 24. The name for it, you guys, is philosophical materialism. Philosophical material. Not materialism like I'm a hype beast and I like Supreme clothes and Air Jordans or whatever, Kanye shoes, whatever, all this dumb shit people like. Materialism in the sense of like all there is in the universe is material things. and the laws of physics and chemistry, and that's it. There's no reason to presume, except for the comfort and the solace it gives us, that there's a higher spiritual order controlled by God or something benevolent like that's giving our life purpose and meaning, okay? We give it meaning ourselves through schooling, through culture, through our education, and so on, but we don't, it's not there in the absence of us, okay? We invented those notions. Philosophical materialism, I'm reading here, the postulate, that is to state, to claim, to argue, the argument that matter is the stuff of all existence and that all mental and spiritual phenomena are its byproducts. And that was it. Okay? No notion could be more upsetting to the deepest traditions of Western thought than the statement that the mind, that right there, this beautiful thing we all have, however complex and powerful, is simply a product of the brain. So Darwin was saying that. Darwin was saying you could explain how humans emerged and got these big brains, which we'll look at in the next essay shortly, from his laws of evolution through natural selection. You just need, what do you need a lot of? Not God and so on. You just need a lot of goddamn time. And that's what had been discovered in the couple generations prior to Darwin. That was that time was deep. Time was not thousands of years, but billions. History was billions of years. Okay? Multiple orders of magnitude greater than we thought from taking the Bible literally. Okay? And this has all been demonstrated by radio spectrometry, measuring the decay of atoms and lead and so on. I won't bore you with all that, but this stuff that Darwin is working with is factually confirmed. Okay? And who embraced this too? Who embraced this? Who embraced Darwin? The most ardent materialists of the time, Marx and ENGL. So look at this. I'm on page, just to give you some sense of this. Sorry, we'll go to Marx in a second, but just to give you a sense of how what Darwin was saying was so shocking. Look on page 25, middle of the page here. Yet Darwin cut through 2,000 years of philosophy and religion in the most remarkable epigram. That's like an aphorism, like these things I'm asking you to write. Epigram's like a witty short statement. Epigram of the M notebook. These are his unpublished notebooks, his manuscripts he was working out all his ideas in that he didn't want anyone to see until after his death. It's a common part of any significant intellectual's life. Darwin cut through 2,000 years of history since Plato. All of Western culture with this following statement. And this is a quote from Darwin, when Plato says in the Phaedo, that's one of Plato's dialogues, that our imaginary ideas arise from the pre-existence of the soul, are not derivable from experience, read Monkeys for pre-existence. So then read that way, you guys. Plato says in Phaedo that our imaginary ideas arise from the monkeys of the soul. That our brain matter, our who we are as humans, it's due to our long-term evolution, okay? To our pre-human and our hominid, our closely related human ancestors who stood up. And once they stood up, the brain emerged, okay? And that's what the next couple videos will be about. Okay, so Darwin's delay was he's afraid. He was afraid to come out with this because people with that supposition of materialism, no God, no higher spiritual realm, just the material world that we see around us, those people were swiftly kicked out of academia. Marx could never get a job, worked as a journalist. They were chased and hounded out of countries. Marx was often in exile, working as a writer, winding up in England eventually, basically supported by Engels. Okay, so Darwin didn't want that punishment. He only published the book when he did because someone else, his cousin Alfred Lord Wallace, was on the trail of the same idea, and he gave Darwin the ability to get to it first. Okay, so that's the first idea. Darwin's delay, because he was basically going to have to say he was a materialist like Marx and Engels. Fascinating point in history. Talk to you in a minute.